Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening with Dr. Роберт Satloff. As you can see on my left, we have gathered here tonight to hear a presentation related to this important new book, Among the Righteous, Lost Stories from the Holocaust's Long Reach in Arab Lands. Let me, in this brief introduction, explain why I was particularly pleased to have the privilege of inviting Роберт Satloff to speak to us tonight. At our center, certainly for the last 4 to 5 years, as many of you know who have attended some of our events, quite naturally, we have focused on the problem of anti-Semitism. That is part of our mandate. The historical legacy of anti-Semitism, the causes of anti-Semitism, its effects, its manifestations, its resurgence, and I hardly need to say that this problem, far from going away, appears to be more actual by the passing day. At the same time, I've been very much conscious of the need to provide some kind of light at the end of the proverbial long tunnel. Not in any kind of sentimental or romantic way, but simply because we need to be aware of context when discussing the issue of anti-Semitism, wherever it may be, in Europe, in the Middle East, in other parts of the world. And that's one of the reasons why over the last few years, quite deliberately, I invited a number of speakers who themselves are Arab and Muslim, and or Muslim, who have spoken here, provided a different perspective from the one we conventionally hear from the Arab world. Speakers who have challenged some of the assumptions of Islam and its contemporary more radical manifestations, scholars, people like Father Emil Shofani, who was here in an evening some of you may have attended, about whether or not one can share the memory of the Holocaust. That was an evening conducted in French, but it was something on the interface between dialogue between faiths, dialogue between convictions and different ethnicities, and issues raised by the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, as well as the Arab-Israeli divide. And both of these two polarities are important to our work. Sometimes they may appear in contradiction, but not necessarily so. And one of the things which intrigued me from the moment that I was aware of the appearance of this book is that it seemed to me that it provides a different way to conduct a dialogue that has barely begun in many ways between Jews and Muslims, Jews and Arabs today. But not a dialogue, as so often happens in interfaith discussions, that evades or avoids the often painful and difficult issues, but which puts them on the table and addresses, in this case, meaning the Holocaust in Arab lands, something that has by and large been neglected or overlooked. Only a few days ago, President Chirac, in a ceremony at the Pantheon in central Paris, honored nearly 3,000 French people who had rescued Jews from the Nazis. This, believe it or not, was the first formal tribute ever made to a group now known as the Righteous of France. Today we're 4 days before what has become more or less International Holocaust Day, 27th of January. And tonight we'll be hearing about a more unexpected, far less familiar group of the righteous. Something which for us in Israel may even appear almost surrealistic, namely Arabs as righteous of the nations, Hasidei Umot HaOlam. I should also say that it struck me as more than just a coincidence, or at least a striking coincidence, that on the very day that President Chirac recognized and paid tribute to the righteous of France, on that same day, the number 2 politician in the Front National in France, Bruno Gollnisch, was given a sentence and asked to pay 5,000 euros for having called into question disputed crimes against humanity. In other words, Holocaust denial, that was the term that was used. And here we have these 2 poles, which are very much present in the book that we're going to hear about tonight. Holocaust denial, as I assume that most people in this room are well aware, is an all too palpable presence in the Arab world and in the wider Muslim world. And yet at the same time, we see the beginnings, perhaps, the very first beginnings of another way in which Arabs might address their own past. They might choose to see themselves and the Jews and their own history. That, I think, is one of the important discoveries which Robert Satloff has made in his work. In other words, that the Holocaust also involves Arabs. They were not merely passive bystanders. It's not just a history that is totally irrelevant to them, nor can it be reduced to the fact that certain Arabs, as is well known, were also collaborators and were also, in some sense, participants in some aspects of the final solution. At least here in Israel, we're well aware of the activities of the then leader of the Palestinian Arab National Movement, Haj Amin al-Husseini. But this story is a different story, and it's the one that we're not familiar with. It's the one that shows that beyond those who, in some sense, were complicit in North Africa and other parts of the Middle East, beyond those who were perhaps the majority indifferent, and those who were collaborators in a more or less serious way, there were also Arabs who helped Jews. And as Dr. Satloff made clear to me in a conversation we had just before we came in here, you have to go out and look for them. And that's something perhaps that Jews have not been overly enthusiastic about doing. And the other side of the coin, about which we'll hear more, is why Arabs have also been reluctant to delve into this particular history. So what we have here is a study which deals with one of the most crucial layers of memory, Jewish memory, Arab memory, which embraces culture and politics, and which digs up, brings to the surface a repressed past, a lost past from more than 60 years ago. Dr. Satloff will tell you about his quest, no doubt, a fascinating adventure because it spanned 4 years, I believe, of work, of interviews, of archival research, and many different countries. Difficult questions which are addressed in this book, and also, I believe, a hope that despite the ominous signs, despite the Holocaust denial brazenly, actively coming out of Iran and finding such a strong resonance and echo in the Arab world, despite the constant claim that we hear that Palestinians were the victims of the Holocaust in the sense that they were made to pay by the loss of their homeland for crimes inflicted by others upon the Jewish people. Despite all those very serious obstacles, there is another way, a more constructive perhaps, a more positive way to address this memory, and that's what's proposed to us in the book. I think that Robert Satloff is eminently equipped to have engaged in this study. He's the executive director of the Washington Institute since 1993. He's an expert in Arab and Islamic politics. He is very active both as a thinker and as a speaker on subjects that have been related to the Arab-Israeli peace process. Apart from this book, he's the author of altogether he's the author of 9 books and monographs. One which I wanted to mention in particular, a collection of essays entitled The Battle of Ideas in the War on Terror. And one point which I personally found fascinating, something I was entirely unaware of, he's the creator and host of a program, Dakhil Washington, more or less, inside Washington, which is beamed out to the Arab world, to many different countries, and he's the only non-Arab to host such a program, which gives him the possibility really to reach millions of Arabs, which is in itself something particularly important these days. So I'm very pleased to welcome Robert Satloff. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor, that was a lovely and warm and generous introduction. I wish my mother were here to hear it. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to speak here. This institution, the Vidal Sassoon Center, is recognized around the world for its leadership in identifying, analyzing, and disseminating understanding of anti-Semitism in all of its many forms, and it's a real honor for me to be here. I'd also like to say that I am privileged to be a guest of the U.S. State Department on this trip, which began in Cairo and now ends here in Jerusalem. I don't speak for the State Department, and as I'm sure you will understand as I finish my talk, but no, that's not true. I don't speak for the State Department, but as an American, it's a real privilege to be asked to speak by the U.S. State Department. It is also a great privilege for me to be able to speak on this topic in Israel. And as I say to all Israeli audiences, and I said it today, I think at least 5 times at Yad Vashem when I delivered essentially this talk earlier today, it is with the greatest amount of humility and modesty that I come to the State of Israel to talk on any topic that is related to the Holocaust. And please accept that with everything that it means to me as an American, as a historian, and as a Jew. It is a bit presumptuous of me to talk in an audience like this, and so I hope that I live up to the expectations of someone who is so presumptuous to talk on this topic in this country. I have a bit of cognitive dissonance about talking on this topic in Israel because I just arrived a couple of days ago from Egypt, where I gave almost exactly the same talk I'm about to give you, I'm about to deliver this evening. I gave this talk in 4 or so different public lectures. I gave this talk, or the themes of this, in interviews on Egyptian national television 4 different times, on satellite TV, Egyptian national TV, for interviews that usually ran between 30 and 45 minutes long. And perhaps most remarkably of all, I gave this talk at a special meeting that was convened for me by a person who I don't normally have wonderful words of praise, and this is the Secretary General of the Arab League, Amr Moussa. But to his credit, Amr Moussa abided by a commitment that wasn't even really a commitment. He accepted an invitation that I made for myself. He agreed to call together in the headquarters of the Arab League around the great King Arthur-like round table that is the deliberating body of the Arab League. He called together all the ambassadors of the Arab League for me to deliver, actually under false pretenses. He told them I was going to deliver a talk on the Middle East peace process. But that's okay. He called them together on an occasion at which I delivered in Arabic a lecture on the Arab role in the Holocaust, the role of Arab perpetrators and the role of Arab heroes, and the importance of these stories for Holocaust education, for the goal of genocide prevention in Arab curricula, and why it is important to have this for Arabs in their own curricula, why it's important for them and why it's important for me as an American and a global citizen. Now, I'm not going to tell you that my way in Cairo was sprinkled with rose petals, because it wasn't. And if you look at the Egyptian media over the last week, you see headlines in opposition media, left and right, criticizing me for what I said, and how is it possible that we let people like this into Cairo to do this. But there was not a word of criticism in the official media. Quite the contrary. The official media, for example, the newspaper of the president's son, Rozel Yousef, Gamal Mubarak, the president's son, ran a very straight 2-page full-spread review of my book. The evening after, or the morning after my talk at the Arab League, I should say late that night, to be more precise, late that night, I received a phone call from the spokesman of the Arab League, Amr Moussa's spokesman, and in which he said, would you be interested and willing to appear on a television show tomorrow morning so that you have another opportunity to relay this message? And a very straight interview, almost exactly what I'm about to say to you this evening. For a half an hour, I discussed this theme. Now, I am not one who thinks that lions lie down with lambs. I don't think that the world has changed. The sun still rises in the east, and there are still deep and fundamental problems in Arab societies having to deal with this issue, Egyptian society specifically, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But one cannot overlook this rather remarkable turn. Certainly for someone like me who spent almost 25 years living and traveling in this part of the world. And I have an explanation which has to do with Iran, which has to do with the deep divide between Arabs and Iranians, Persians, the reluctance of Arabs to want to be tarred with the same brush that Ahmadinejad is painting on the landscape of Holocaust denial these days. And I fully understand the political context in which I was welcomed in Cairo. That being said, the world is political. We live in a political world. We should take advantage of opportunities when they present themselves. And from my perspective, there is a moment of opportunity now to begin to talk, at least begin to talk with Arabs of goodwill about the Holocaust in a different way. Now, I came to a personal decision 5 years ago. It was really began with September 11th, both on a personal and a professional basis, that I wanted to contribute to the hatred that was manifested by September 11th by fighting Holocaust denial in Arab societies. This would be my personal contribution. It had to do originally with my personal experience being in Manhattan on 9/11, a story that was no worse than any, and actually a lot better than the poor souls that perished that day. And seeing the image in my mind of the towers of 9/11 with this puff of smoke coming out the top of them, eventually morphed in my imagination, evolved in my imagination to the chimneys of Auschwitz. And just I'll say parenthetically, as I have given this talk since my book came out in many locales in the United States, I'm surprised at the number of victims of the Shoah, survivors, that is, who have come up to me and said, I didn't want to tell anybody this, but I had the exact same thought. And if it wasn't the chimneys, then it was the ash. The ash. How much it reminded me of the Holocaust. But analytically, what connected it to me was the idea that for a brief period, only 2 hours, of course, the perpetrators of 9/11 used the greatest technology of the day to kill as many people as rapidly and efficiently as possible, which, of course, was the formula of the Germans, a formula that lasted for years, not just 2 hours. But it got me thinking. It got me thinking about perceptions of the Holocaust in Arab societies, not so much because I had any idea that Mohammed Atta and his colleagues would ever think about such things, but about the rest of Arab society. And shortly after 9/11, I wrote an essay in which I pointed out that, to the best of my effort to find, there wasn't a single educational text or piece of curriculum in any Arab society that I could find in which the Holocaust was taught either in and of itself or even as part of a larger discussion of genocide prevention. And I figured this is something that needs to be addressed. It is not acceptable to me as an American for an entire people to be exempt from knowledge of the Holocaust. For me, this is a national security issue. It is not just a social and political issue. That I suffer when millions of people are exempt from understanding genocide in general and the Holocaust in particular. And so then I decided that I was going to try to find a way to address Holocaust denial in this part of the world. The key was to figure out how. There are two traditional ways of talking about the Holocaust to Arab and Muslim societies. First is to talk about the traditional European narrative, the overwhelming narrative of European fascists exterminating European Jewry. This is very important, and this is essential. Regrettably, however, it is ineffective. I may not like it, but it is regrettably ineffective in this part of the world. The second traditional strategy is to make a list, recite a litany of the most extreme, obscene, grotesque things that one sees, read, or hears in Arab television, Arab popular culture, magazines, radio, school books, etc., about the Holocaust. And in so doing, to try to shame Arabs into having a different view, into changing their approach. This is important, and this is essential, but this is similarly ineffective in a wide scale, regrettably so. And so I had to try to come up with a different way, how to engage Arabs, certainly Arabs of goodwill, especially those Arabs for whom the main issue is not denial, because denial is a choice, but Arabs for whom the main context is ignorance. Ignorance. And I'll say parenthetically, in my view, this describes the majority of people in this part of the world. Ignorance. Their history books are wiped clean. They're wiped clean of discussions of their own history. They're certainly wiped clean of discussions of the Holocaust. And what they know about it, they get from Al Jazeera or they get from horribly grotesque popular culture. So to address ignorance in this Arab world, how to do it? And one day, shortly after September 11th, I came up with the idea to ask this question. Did any Arabs save any Jews during the Holocaust? And if so, isn't that the most positive, constructive response to Holocaust denial? Because if Arabs saved a Jew, if there was an Arab that saved a Jew, and this is something about which Arabs could be proud, you have to accept the context, that there was something to save that Jew from. It forces people, it may force people to think. It may force people to think differently about this. And so began a search. First a search for just one Arab who saved one Jew. It evolved and grew into, as what you just heard, into an 11-country, 4-continent search to learn about the experience of Holocaust in Arab lands and the role that Arabs played in it. As I said, the search grew, and it became really 3 questions. Question 1 is, what happened to Jews in Arab lands in general? First, what happened? In brief, the story is this. From the period of spring of 1940 to the spring of 1943, principally in the lands of North Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya. These were the lands that were under the control of Germany and its Vichy, French, and Italian fascist allies. In these lands lived approximately 500,000 Jews. And to varying degrees and in different ways, in these lands, the Germans and their partners imposed all the elements of the final solution except the final solution. That is, there were no death camps, there were no extermination camps. But virtually all the other elements that Jews suffered in varying degrees in Europe were imposed in parts of these Arab lands. There were only 2 places in the world, for example, where Jews were stripped of their citizenship in the entire world. One was Germany. The other was Algeria, where over 90% of the Jews were stripped of their citizenship by Vichy French. The Vichy laws were imposed in Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, and eventually the fascist laws against Jews were imposed in Libya. Laws that governed where Jews could live, what they could do, where they could study. In some places, the laws were imposed in Arab lands even more strictly than in Europe. So, for example, the quotas on whether Jews could go to school were imposed with greater severity in Algeria than they were in metropolitan France. We can discuss why if you'd like later on. There were confiscations of Jewish property, Jewish stores, shops, businesses. Jews were denied rations. Jews were on the lowest rung of the ration ladder. First it was Europeans, then Muslims, then Jews. There were slave labor camps, or labor camps set up. This, for example, is a German map showing some of the major labor camps that were set up from the Atlantic on one side through Tunisia, and then, of course, there were other camps in Libya. I was very pleased, I will just say parenthetically, I was very pleased today to have an opportunity to visit the new Yad Vashem and to see a map that showed some of these camps up on one of the new displays. Not all of them. I suggested that additional camps be placed on the map, but I think it's very important. Thousands of Jews were sent to these camps, including several thousand European Jews that were deported from Europe for no other reason than the fact that they were Jews. As a matter of fact, if you were a loyal Frenchman, Jewish, a loyal Frenchman, and you fought in the French army against the Germans in the spring of 1940, and then you were defeated, your reward for your wartime valor, chances were that you were sent to a labor camp in the Sahara Desert, that your job was to try to build this absurd colonial idea of a trans-Sahara railway. This was your reward. This is an official list of the more than 100 labor camps for which the German government now takes responsibility in negotiations with the Claims Conference. It is an exhaustive list. One of the great measures of pride I took in my research was to play a small role in helping bring about these agreements through some of my findings. It was only last summer that the German government, who I should say took responsibility for everything that the French did, even though the Germans never asked the French to do anything in terms of the persecution of Jews in Arab lands. But the German government took responsibility for for Jews who were in Vichy French camps. And just this past summer, they extended an offer of compensation. They extended an offer of pensions, which is really the highest recognition to the Jewish survivors from camps in Tunisia. They sent their worst Nazi killers to impose this persecution. And again, let me say parenthetically, perhaps this audience knows this better than most, for a few months of the war, Tunisia was the most important battleground of World War II. For a few months of the war, the most important piece of territory in the European theater was not in Europe at all. It was in North Africa. This is where Hitler had told his troops, defend this land at all costs. This was the gateway to Europe. This was where the war was fought. Despite the fact that the Germans never had control of more than half of Tunisia, despite the fact that they were under bombardment every day from Allied bombers, despite this, the Germans still sent people like Colonel Walter Rauff to run the SS architecture of persecution. This, to me, is a clear message of intent. This, to me, says precisely what the Germans had in mind. They rounded up Jews not out in the villages, not only out in the villages, but in the heart of Tunis, right through downtown Tunis. Tunisian Jews, of course, have their own essential equivalent of Kristallnacht, December 9th, 1942, the great Rafla, the great roundup of Jews in the heart of Tunis by the SS. Jews in some parts of Tunisia were forced to wear the yellow star. Here you can see it in its 5-pointed variety. Sometimes it was 5 points, sometimes 6 points, but even this. There were labor camps, as I said. This is what's left standing from, if you go back to this chart, if you can see along here. Right here, Tandrara, along the Moroccan-Algerian border. It was just 3 years ago that I and my wife and my family, my 2 kids, we hopped into a car, our Land Rover in Rabat, and drove 1,500 kilometers east in search of the remains of these camps. What was left? I wanted to find out what was left. Is anything still there? And we found in Bergent, one of the, I think the only all-Jewish camp in Vichy, North Africa, we found the cemetery, a Jewish cemetery that is not included on any register that I found of international Jewish cemeteries. Further down the railroad tracks, there's this, out in the middle of absolute nowhere, Tendrara, the completely empty buildings, what's left from the camp. You don't have to go that far. This is the German-constructed camp, the buildings that are left in Bizerte, on the Tunisian coast, Tunisia's main port along the Mediterranean. This is what happened. Numerically, it is not even comparable in any way, shape, or form to the great tragedy, the grotesque killing in Europe. Only 1% of the Jews of these Arab lands died under Axis control, compared with more than half the Jews of Europe, more than half the Jews on the Wannsee list. But I am convinced, from lots of evidence, I'm convinced that if the war had not been over in the spring of 1943 in this part of the world, then the fate of the Jews of this part of the world would have been the same as the fate of Jews of Europe. So that's what happened. What role did Arabs play? This is my second question. What role did Arabs play in this? Here, whenever I ask this, when I talk about this, especially in Arab countries and to Arabs, I'm immediately accused of talking about guilt and responsibility. So let me be clear. This is not a question of guilt and responsibility. In my view, the Holocaust, the people guilty for the Holocaust are Germans and their European partners who came up with the idea to exterminate the Jewish people and implemented the idea to exterminate the Jewish people. They are guilty and responsible. Arabs lived in countries under which they had no political control. This is not a collective guilt, a collective issue. I am focused on choices. What choices did Arabs make when this persecution was going on around them, what did individuals do? What did they do? Well, they did the following. This is what I found. The vast majority of Arabs were indifferent to the fate of the Jews. Indifference of two sorts. First, there was indifference of those people who were just too concerned with the demands of surviving in war. War in North Africa was not the same as war in Europe, but it was bad enough. And to them, it was difficult. And many people had to find all different ways to try to survive themselves and their families. Indifferent. And then there was a different sort of indifference, a more malicious indifference. The indifference of those people who did not participate in the persecution, but who were its cheerleaders. And if you go, for example, to this picture of Jews being marched through the streets of Tunis, there are many, many testimonies of these Jews who recall that as they were marching through Tunis and other places, they heard screams from the windows and the balconies above saying terrible things, cheering on the forced march of Jews through the streets of Tunis. Not participants, but cheerleaders. Then a second group, a minority, because the majority were indifferent, but a minority, however a regrettably large minority, were participants, collaborators, perpetrators, people who to varying degrees assisted in the persecution of Jews. One finds this from high levels of government down to ordinary people. Whether it's the Grand Vizier of Morocco, down to the thousands of Arabs who played roles as guards at the more than 100 camps. These camps could not have functioned if there were not local Arab guards to serve, to make them happen. Down to Arab informants who went door to door with the SS in Tunisia, pointing out where Jews lived, etc. Arabs played roles. Some Arabs made that choice. And then other Arabs made other choices. Choices to help, or perhaps even save and rescue Jews. Now, some of these people are people whose names we'll never know. One of the wonders of doing this research is that it was extremely difficult to do this 60 years after the end of the war on one end. But on the other hand, it was impossible to do without the internet. I had postings on listservs and websites all over the world. And you would be surprised how many people in their 70s and 80s use the internet. And I've got people sending me stories, wonderful stories. I received stories of Arab wet nurses who took in Jewish babies because there wasn't enough milk to be rationed for Jews to have. Or Arab bakers. These are stories from Jews thanking, remembering what happened. Or Arab bakers who would bake extra loaves of bread to put them aside because Jews didn't have the rations. Or Arab shepherds who offered their huts to Jews who were looking for sanctuary from their bombed-out villages. These sorts of things. Wonderful stories of human kindness. No, they don't rise to the level of the righteous. But they're still important stories, important to remember. Then, for example, up the ladder a bit, there's a wonderful story that occurred in Algiers. A story that is, I think, very important to recall. Algiers is the capital of Vichy French North Africa. And the Vichy were eager to entice as many Arabs as possible to support them. And they wanted to bribe them. And they offered as a bribe the opportunity to serve as custodians of Jewish property, as custodians of confiscated Jewish property. If you accepted, you could run the factory, the shop, the store of a Jew, and make a lot of money in the process. Very lucrative. Except that one day in the spring of 1941, all the mosque preachers of Algiers issued a khutbah, issued a speech from the mosques, saying it was mamnu', it was forbidden to accept this bribe. Now, the most important thing is not that all the imams of Algiers issued this edict. The most important thing is not a single Arab in Algiers accepted the bribe. Not a single one broke the edict. And this is remembered by the Jews of Algiers as a sign of comradeship at a time of peril. And then there are other stories. There are well-known stories. For example, this is the Sultan of Morocco, pictured here with Charles de Gaulle. And this is Munsif Bey, the ruler of Tunisia. Tunisia was also a monarchy of sorts, a principality at the time. People tend to forget the Tunisian story because, first of all, history is, as everyone here knows, history is written by the victors. And Tunisia, in general, the monarchy was since it was overthrown 10 years later, the monarchy has been subsumed in history, and people don't tend to focus on it. Munsif Bey himself was forced from office by the Free French shortly after the German evacuation because he was accused of being a collaborator. He had the most unique position of any Arab wartime leader because he was the wartime leader of the only Arab country to have a German occupation. And it's a very sensitive position. My own view is that Munsif Bey deserves a second look as to his role. And I can only say this. A couple of years ago when I was in Tunis, I went to see the Grand Rabbi of Tunis, he since passed away, who lived in an apartment building. And only in Tunis does the Grand Rabbi live on Rue de Palestine. It's uniquely Tunisian, I think. He lived in an apartment building, and immediately next door to him, on the same floor, in the next flat, was the oldest living heir of the Tunisian royal family. Now, the royal family had lost all of its property and all of its wealth, and he was living in this little flat, 2-room flat, 3-room flat. And he was very old. He since passed away. But he welcomed me into the apartment, and we talked. And he said, look, you don't have to believe me about what Munsif Bey and my family did for the Jews, but believe the following. This apartment that we're in, it was paid for by the Jews. My children's education, paid for by the Jews. My health care, paid for by the Jews. You don't have to believe me, but believe me that the Jews remember fondly my family. And that, I thought, was a very powerful message. Now, I think both Munsif Bey and Mohammed Sank gave very important moral support to the Jews of their countries. In some individual cases, there was assistance to individuals. The most important part of this is the legacy that they are held by the Jewish communities of these countries. In addition, I found real stories, human stories, of Arabs who actually saved Jewish lives. Saved Jewish lives. This, for example, is Si Ali Sakat. Si Ali Sakat was the former mayor of Tunis, the appointed mayor of Tunis, who retired to a country home in Bir Halima in the Zahwan Valley, about 30 kilometers or so, 35 kilometers outside of Tunis, right near the front line of what was the major battle of Tunisia. Now, at one point, at the heat of battle, 60 Jews came banging at his door. These were Jews who had left an Axis camp looking for refuge at the heat of battle. And he had to make a decision, let them in or not. He didn't know who was going to win the war. He didn't know who was going to win that battle. He made a decision to let them in. And he provided them all refuge here on the farm. This is one of his grandchildren who took me around the farm. And one can imagine, if you go to this farm, it's really more like a hacienda with high walls on the four corners. You can imagine him saying to his farmhands, find space, get blankets. We have to find room. One can imagine this. And then there's the story of this man. I call him the Tunisian Paul Newman. His name is Khalid Abdul Wahab. Khalid was the son of a very famous Tunisian homme de belles lettres, a very famous Tunisian man of letters named Hassan Husni Abdul Wahab. And they come from the seaside town of Mahdia. And Khalid had already been a man of the world. He had already been to America. He had already been to France. He was back in his hometown. And he took it upon himself to be one of the interlocutors between the leaders of the town and the German occupation authorities. And one evening, he overheard a German officer saying that he was going that evening to rape a blonde, blue-eyed, beautiful Jewish woman. Actually, this woman in her wedding photo. And Khalid knew who the family was, and he got there first. The family had already been evicted from their home, which the Germans had taken as a barracks, and with several other families had taken refuge in an olive press factory. And Khalid got to the olive press factory, banged on the door, and said, "You have to come with me." And late that night, he ferried everybody back and forth from that factory to a farm that his family, wealthy family, had in Tlelsa, a small town about 20 or so kilometers outside of Makhtia. And he kept them there and safeguarded them for 6 weeks until the end of the German occupation. This is a remarkable story and a wonderful story. And to me, what makes this most important is that it was told to me by this woman's then 11-year-old daughter, who 60 years later tracked me down. She was living in a retirement complex outside Los Angeles, and I was living in Morocco. And she told it to me with such fervor, this story on the internet. She kept coming back to me, saying, you have to, please listen to me, please listen to me. That one day, I said, okay. And so I hired a professional interviewer from the Shoah Foundation in Los Angeles, that's Steven Spielberg's foundation, to go and take her testimony. And it produced an 83-page transcript of her experience. And then that woman, Annie Buchris, died. She died just a couple of weeks later, having told her story completely for the first time. So armed with this story, I had to just see whether it was true. One never really knows about memory. Memory is a very difficult thing. I think people in Israel understand memory perhaps better than anyone in the world. But memory is a difficult thing, and one has to try to prove it. And what I did is I took her testimony, and I went back to her hometown. And I found some of her childhood friends, little old ladies who 70 years ago, 65 years ago, she played with on the streets of this town. She had mentioned that, who she played with. And I found them. And they must have been so surprised. I knock at their door completely out of the blue, saying, "I'm an American professor. I'm here to talk to you about Annie Buchris." They hadn't heard a word from Annie Buchris in decades. Well, to make this long story short, they confirmed, without me leading them on, they confirmed, yes, Khalid Abdul Wahab took Annie and her family to the farm. And then I went to the farm, and I looked around, and it was precisely the way Annie had described it from her memory 60 years ago, exactly. And then fortuitously, about a year later, I just was lucky, and I found one of the other families that Khalid had protected, and I found another person to confirm this. So that story, I think, is really wonderful. And then, just lastly, I'll mention this story. This is important for me because this is a story that occurred right in the heart of Europe, right in Paris, under the eyes and ears of the German occupation. This, on the right, is Si Kaddour Ben Ghabrit, in my view, the most influential Arab in all of Europe. Si Kaddour Ben Ghabrit was the founder, the builder, and the imam, the rector, of La Grande Mosque de Paris, the Great Mosque of Paris, the most important Muslim religious institution of Europe, certainly at the time. Now, Ben Ghabrit, who you see here hosting Nazis at the mosque, because this was a very important propaganda coup for the Germans to be able to have these sorts of pictures. There is compelling evidence that Ben Ghabrit saved up to 100 Jews. These are Jews from North Africa who found themselves stranded in France during the war, that he saved up to 100 Jews in a very clever fashion. He provided them with certificates of Muslim identity, birth certificates, marriage certificates, so they could pass as Muslims and thereby evade deportation and certain death. There's even a story regarding a very famous Jewish singer named Simon Halali. Simon Halali was an Algerian Berber Jewish singer, well known even in those days. And in order to ensure that Halali would not be taken, Ben Ghabrit went one step further. He had Halali's grandfather's name inscribed on a tombstone in the Muslim cemetery outside of Paris. so that when the Germans did come for Halali, he had this extra piece of evidence to protect him. He just died about 2 years ago, maybe even less. And almost every obituary relates the story of how Ben Gabrit saved his life. Look, these I think are wonderful stories. I think they are very important. I think it's important to learn the entire experience of Arabs during the Holocaust, the stories of the perpetrators and the stories of the heroes. And the third and last question I had in my research was, why now? Why, after only 60 years, are we hearing these stories? I mean, with all humility, I may be a brilliant historian, but there has to be a better reason why. Why, for the first time now, these stories are coming out, or why they haven't come out until now. And there's really two reasons why they haven't come out till now. This is the last chapter of my book. There's two reasons. One, we, the collective we Jews, we historians, we the West, we didn't look too hard. We didn't look too hard at this chapter of the Holocaust. We certainly didn't look too hard for Arabs who may have saved Jews. I don't have to tell an audience like this how, during certain period in this country's history, the Holocaust was, in some respects, a point of division between Sephardi Jews and Ashkenazi Jews, not necessarily a point of unity. I hope, and as I understand, that entire process is changing. But I think it helps to explain, to a certain extent, why this was not a high priority. Then the second half of the answer, on the one hand, we didn't look too hard. We didn't look too hard, just one more sentence, for somewhat understandable reasons. And let me also repeat this. The Holocaust was overwhelmingly a European story. It was overwhelmingly European. So it's understandable, but it still is the fact that we didn't look too hard. The other side of the coin is that they, the Arabs, they didn't want to be found. Certainly the perpetrators, but even the heroes. Even the heroes. You remember I told you the story of this gentleman, Siali Sakat, who opened his farm to 60 Jews in the spring of 43. I met two of his grandchildren, very lovely gentlemen, one in Paris, one in Tunis. And I explained to them the story of their grandfather, and they both said in almost exactly the same words the following. They said, you know, it's very interesting what you tell us about my grandfather, and I'm very happy to hear it. But you know, it's very different than the story we tell in our family. In our family, we tell a different story about hospitality and generosity that our grandfather extended at the end of the war. But it's a story of our grandfather opening his farm to a group, not of Jews, but of German infantrymen trying to avoid capture as prisoners of war. And we value this story as a sign of our grandfather's hospitality to strangers and people looking for refuge. And I have a great amount of respect for that. I can understand how in that context, at that time, that would be a story worthy of remembrance. There's only one problem. There's not a shred of evidence that Siali Sakat opened his farm to the Germans. But if you look at some of the contemporary books written by Jews in Tunis about the experience of Jews at that time, they talk about Siali Sakat opening his farm to the Jews. Somewhere over the last 60 years, it became unacceptable. It became toxic to recognize and to be proud of the great humanitarian act of saving Jews during the war. Now, one of the objectives of my book is to detoxify this, make it acceptable to talk about saving Jews, as well as to make it acceptable to talk about other choices, more nefarious choices that Arabs made. I I've received quite a lot of response since my book came out. It's been all over the map from Jews and all over the map from Arabs. Overwhelmingly positive from both Jews and Arabs. But I've been critiqued from all sides. The most common Arab response I've received from people who have read the book goes something like this, which is, thank you for telling the stories of Arab heroes. Thank you also for telling the stories of Arab villains. Thank you for telling the good and the bad. Thank you for showing that we Arabs are actors, not just acted upon. Thank you for showing that we make choices, that we are three-dimensional figures, not just two-dimensional figures. This is important for us to hear. Thank you. You know, if any of you have had the opportunity to read anything I've written in my professional life, I am not a romantic about this part of the world. I don't think peace is going to happen tomorrow. I don't think lions are going to lie down with lambs anytime soon. But one of the things that will make the possibility of peace more likely is a deepened sense of responsibility on the part of Arabs, that they are actors responsible for all their choices, good and bad. So when I receive, as I've received many, many emails like that, to me, this is a piece of good news. To be able to speak freely and to be criticized and criticized back, and giving exactly the same talk I just gave in Cairo, is a piece of good news. It is not the end of time. But these days, in a world that is so bleak and dark, I'll take even a small step in the right direction. Thank you very much. I'll be very happy to answer any questions you have on this. Please. If I could ask if you could identify yourself, just so I know who you are.
Yes, Reuben Liebman, and I'd like to know how do you explain the relatively positive reaction that you received in Egypt, considering that Egypt has been for a long time the #1 center for the dissemination of anti-Jewish, anti-Israeli propaganda, the Headless Horseman series, and so forth?
Yes. My explanation, as I said earlier, has to do with politics. Has to do with, fortuitously, luckily, what I am saying and writing has come in a moment when Arabs, Sunni Arabs, want to distinguish themselves from the statements and actions of the president of Iran. They want to point out to the world that they are not like the Shiites. They despise, I don't want to exaggerate, but there is a deep well of animosity that is coming to the surface. This has been my experience in the last period of time, that is coming to the surface in many Arab societies. And I interpret one expression of this as their willingness to think about and talk about and do, perhaps even do, some things a little bit differently than before. This is how I interpret the reaction of Sunni Arab states to Hezbollah and the war in the summer, where they were rooting for Israel like I have never seen Arabs root for Israel in the history of this conflict. And this reflects, to a certain extent, this experience of how Arabs are at least willing to talk about this. I don't want to suggest that there's a profound cultural, social change. But I do want to say that there's a moment of opportunity. There's a moment of opportunity, and those of us, if we live in a political world, then it's our responsibility to take advantage of such opportunities.
At the same time, last week was International Book Week, and Israel was not invited.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, thank you. First, about the camps. Of the 100 or so camps, only a portion of them were solely for Jews. There were, I don't have the numbers at the top of my head, but we're talking about in the 30s in Tunisia, different places of forced labor. Many of those were solely for Jews. At the end of the occupation, of German occupation, some others were also sent. But they were set up principally as camps for Jewish labor. There were a couple in which they were almost exclusively for Jews in Vichy, in say, Morocco. And when I say Morocco, I want to be clear, because I didn't say it earlier. Moroccan Jews were not sent to labor camps. Very small number, but they were sent principally because of their political activity, not because they were Jews. The labor camps in Morocco were for Europeans to be deported by Vichy to Morocco, not Moroccan Jews being sent to camp. The camps there were mixed camps in Morocco and Algeria. There were some labor camps for what were called pionniers israélites, Jews who wanted to who were in the army, were in the military service, actually did forced labor in Algeria too. So it was a mix between them, between Jews and others. As I said, the Germans themselves created and established camps only in Tunisia. Sometimes they were done in tandem with the Italians. There was an Italian zone in Tunisia. The Italians set up these camps in Libya. The main catalytic event in Libya was when the area of Cyrenaica went back and forth between the British and the Axis, and then between the Axis and the British, and then the Axis again. In the intervening period, the Jews of Cyrenaica celebrated, and when the Germans came back, the Jews paid for it. And this was also just after the time when Italian fascists imposed their harshest version of the anti-Jewish laws, and the combination was a decision to send thousands of Libyan Jews to internment camps. The actual worst internment camps, in just sheer numbers, were in Libya, where, for example, at Jado, I see Professor Romani here, at Jado, somewhere around 2,500 people, and approximately a quarter of them died. They weren't killed. They died from the horrible conditions, but that's a huge percentage to die just from horrible conditions in a small place. Now, your second question, in terms of Osama al-Baz, actually, I just spent about an hour and a half with him last week, among other things. Osama al-Baz wrote a series of articles a couple of years ago in response to, I think it was The Horseman, as a matter of fact, about the Holocaust and how we should understand the Holocaust, etc. Let me put it this way. The articles that Osama al-Baz wrote would not have been written and published by Yad Vashem. He did not offer the Yad Vashem version of what happened and its importance and why we should all know about this. He put it in the context of the political struggle, of et cetera, et cetera. But what he did do was rather cleanly and clearly repudiate Holocaust denial. He cleanly and clearly repudiated Holocaust denial, which is a step in the right direction. It is not enough, because there are other Egyptian official institutions and official personages which either nodded or participated in Holocaust denial. It is not enough, but it is in and of itself important. For example, in his final comment at the Arab League meeting last week where I spoke, Amr Moussa, he said, we have deep political conflicts with Israel. Deep, deep, deep political conflicts with Israel. but they are political conflicts. And I, under the name of the Arab League, repudiate this grotesque Holocaust denial. Okay. You know, given the fact that he had just had some of his ambassadors, the Syrian ambassador, for example, go off on a 10-minute tirade about the real genocide that I was overlooking, namely the genocide of the Palestinians. You know, I'll take it for what it was, what Musa said. Nothing more and nothing less. Look, I don't disagree with the thrust of your question. I will only say the following. The problems in this part of the world are difficult enough. The real problems are difficult enough that if we can succeed in clearing away the burden of the extraneous problems, the problems that are layered on top of the real problems, so that we can perhaps, maybe we'll fail, but perhaps we can attempt to address the real problems, this itself is not so bad. Secondly, my own view is that there's a value of this research in Arab or intra-Arab issues. My own view, and this is the subject of the book that was kindly mentioned earlier, namely called The Battle of Ideas in the War on Terror, my own view is that the most important battle going on in this part of the world is within Muslim societies. If you go, in my experience, if you go to any town, village, city, from Morocco through the Gulf, the single most important issue on people's minds is the challenge that Islamic extremism is posing to the way of life of people in this part of the world. And that this is what animates people's daily existence. Are they taking over our schools? Are they taking over my society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Now, I think it's important to try to empower the people who are trying to fight back. And the best thing to empower people like this is to empower them with knowledge. You know, if someone can say, wait a minute, don't tell me this craziness about the Holocaust, about the Jews. Some people did this, some people did that. Don't give me this craziness. Let's talk about Israel. Let's talk about Israel. Fine. But don't give me this terrible stuff about the Jews. I want to empower people. Now, I'm very modest about this because I don't think one person can empower people. But you have to start. You have to try to strengthen the people who are really on the front lines in this battle. Because the bad guys have popular culture. The bad guys in some cases have the understanding of governments. We need to try to put truth and history as a weapon to arm the people fighting against this sort of extremism.
Wow, a lot of questions. Yeah, we'll start with you.
We'll go next to the two sides. Yes.
Two questions, three questions. Do you have a number for each country of Arabs that have saved Jews with travels and research? The second question is, on the 10th of March, 1943, La Marsa and La Boulette was bombarded. Do you have any documentation or any information?
First, on the statistics, number of Arabs who saved Jews. No, I don't. Mine is not, as I say quite clearly in the beginning and the end of my book, mine is not the exhaustive study on this topic. I'm very happy, I would be delighted if a team of graduate students would take it upon themselves to chronicle every site of Jewish persecution in Arab countries. People should go there, should demarcate, should put memorials, etc. And people did a systematic study of exactly what Arab leaders, officials, individuals did during the war. My book is just the tip of the iceberg. And as I was leaving my last trip to Tunis, I had just interviewed Khalid Abdul Wahab's daughter, one of his daughters. And that night, I go into a bookstore, I pick up a book about a Tunisian doctor in Nablus, and I open it, and it says, during World War II, he saved Jews. I couldn't, this is the night I left. And then I had coffee late that night or the next day, just before I left, with a Tunisian filmmaker who told me that he tried to raise money from the European Union to do a film about the shepherds in Tabarka that saved Jews. Look, I don't know, I didn't have a chance to track all these things down. But my point is, I think there are more stories out there. If in 6 million people exterminated in Europe, we have certified, Yad Vashem has certified 21,000 approximately righteous, then in a part of the world where there was no extermination, and we have found already a handful by just one guy looking, I think that there are more stories out there to be found. About La Marsa, if memory serves me, this was the event where several dozen Jews were killed in the bombing, and there was a rather grotesque response from a group of local Arabs who violated some of the corpses. I found testimonies about this, cutting off some of the jewelry and etc. I think there was a great difficulty in being able to take the corpses to the cemetery that the Jewish community wanted to take them to. I don't remember all the details right now. It's been some years since I looked at it, but I did find some. I remember some of the details regarding the episode. Yes, on this corner, and then this gentleman in the far left. Yes.
What about Bosnia? Even though we know Bosnia is not an Arab land, it's in Europe, but it's a Muslim land. It's used to be a majority.
Yes, look, I usually have a line. I didn't say it for some reason. It is absolutely true that there are Muslims who saved Jews. The Yad Vashem has among its righteous Turks and Bosnians and Albanians. This is absolutely true. My focus is on the question, why no Arabs? If there was persecution in these lands, if Jews died in these lands, did Arabs have such a different DNA that not one saved a Jew? That was really my motivating question. And so I just know in general what happened in Bosnia, but I didn't focus on Bosnia or Albania or Turkey. I focused on the part of this part of the world. Yes, sir.
came to the conclusion that it's more easy to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict with pictures of the Holocaust than with weapons. I have this experience. I need only 1 minute to convince the Palestinians to admit and to acknowledge the Holocaust and to know the sincerity and the importance of the Holocaust for their own sake. The problem is here. You said that the Arabs they don't teach the Holocaust. But the problem that Israel don't teach the Holocaust to the Arab citizens in Israel. This is it. So Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza 30 years. They never brought a picture of the Holocaust to the Palestinians up to now, 60 years. I know the complexity of the Holocaust issue in the soul and the mind of the Jewish people. But we have to overcome this. This is the problem. That the Holocaust is, I give explanation for that because I made a research about it. The problem is that the Jewish people never told the Arabs, please acknowledge the Holocaust. Up to now. I had an interview with the Italian television today, and I said to them, Mr. Lermer can't say, he can't take a picture of the Holocaust and send a letter to Ahmadinejad and to Hamas leader and to all those who deny the Holocaust and those who don't deny the Holocaust and ask them to acknowledge the Holocaust. This step hadn't been done before. So we have, I think, with my experience, very small, because it's very private, I could convince many people. And they are supporting me in studying, analyzing the Holocaust. Because the denial thing, the Holocaust, among the Arabs, comes from the fact that they know nothing about the Holocaust. Because their mind, there's no information. So they can't analyze. The only weapon they have is just to deny it. This thing, I think that an address from the Jewish people to the Arabs, especially to the Palestinians, to acknowledge the Holocaust is the first step to bring peace for both people. Because the importance of the Holocaust is the one. This is the only thing, the only power in the world that can bring peace to the Palestinians and to the Israelis is the Holocaust. Nothing else. That's my notice. Thank you.
Are you Mr. Mohammed?
Yes.
Oh, yes. I've read about you, and I was very sorry to hear that you didn't get your visa to Iran. Look, I'm not sure that I necessarily agree about the importance of the Jewish people asking the Palestinians for this sort of group recognition, but I do agree that with the following, that it is very important to try to address the ignorance. There are really, when we talk about Holocaust denial, we're really putting three different things under the same category, three very different things. First is denial, the sort of thing that we've heard from Ahmadinejad, which actually has its roots in this part of the world. It was really Gamal Abdul Nasser, who in '64 was the first Arab leader to say the Holocaust couldn't have happened. And he said it to a German newspaper, of all places. That's denial. But then on the other end of the spectrum is not denial, it's glorification. Not that the Holocaust didn't happen, but yes, it happened and it was good. And you hear some of this, you read some of this. Egyptian newspapers had this. The general trend in the Middle East, however, in my experience, is neither this denial nor this glorification. The most common phenomenon is ignorance. It's that most people just don't know. And I'm not talking about men in the street. I have some very well-educated, highly placed friends in Arab governments or in international institutions, very suave, sophisticated people who don't have the foggiest idea what happened, who don't have what happened in Europe, who don't have the foggiest idea what happened in their own countries. I have friends of mine in Tunisia who haven't the foggiest idea that there was a German occupation, or that Jews were put into labor camps, or that people wore the yellow star, or that there were confiscated properties. Didn't have the foggiest idea, even if some of their parents or grandparents may have played a role, or maybe because their parents or grandparents played a role, don't have the foggiest idea. And I think it's extremely important to find any avenue to try to address this. Yes, sir.
Sorry, I would try and bridge your address tonight with, I guess, more of the things that you've written over your career. You made mention right at the end of your talk about reactions that you've gotten from Arabs about your book. Thank you for suggesting that we're players and not merely played upon, et cetera, et cetera. Is there any indication that the powers that be, that the we, as you said, we the Jews, we Israel, we Americans, we the West, are moving or will move in a direction to recognize those individuals who are wanting to take responsibility for their own fate, for wanting to be players of their own destiny, rather than what we've seen for such a long time?
Well, first, the narrow question which you're asking, which is, will there be an Arab recognized as a righteous? I have been very warmly welcomed by Yad Vashem, who's quite interested in this research, and I know that they are. It's not that I know. Even about a month ago, I was quite delighted to see in print that Yad Vashem is formally considering Khalid Abdul Wahab for recognition as righteous, which I think would have a very powerful impact in many parts of Arab societies. First, it would confound the deniers. It wouldn't change their minds, because people are deniers because they choose to be deniers. But it would confound them. They'd have to come to grips with this very strange story. And I think it would empower people of goodwill. So that's the answer to a narrow part of your question. In terms of the wider part of your question, I don't think that we do enough. I don't think that we do enough to recognize this vitally important ideological war which is going on in Muslim societies, and how their victory is our victory, and why we should invest in those people that are trying to fight against radical extremists. I don't think we do enough politically, culturally, in almost any direction. And I wish that my book has dozens of suggestions for what more we should do, but I think there's a lot more that we collectively should do to fight that, to help them fight that battle. On this side, yes, please.
Rachel Brandenburg from UC, actually studying in Israel and Fulbright grant for the year.
Hi.
My question is sort of twofold. One on education. You mentioned a few times the importance of education, but in your visits to different Arab countries, have you discussed with any of the leadership or people you've spoken with about how to translate this into education? And to bring it back to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I've been involved in a number of dialogue initiatives where conversation almost always turns to the refugee issue for Palestinians here, and a Jew will say, or an Israeli will say, well, there are refugees from European, from Arab lands, and the Palestinian will say, we have nothing to do with that, the Arab countries have nothing to do with that, so it's irrelevant for our situation. And this sort of brings up that Arab countries did have work to do with it, for good and bad. And do you see any way of sort of productively translating some of these stories into education in the context of this conflict?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. First, I tend to talk about the educational aspect of this in two contexts. One is how important it is for Arabs to know more about genocide. Genocide prevention. Why are they the only people in the world, virtually the only people of the world, who are exempt from learning about genocide? You can't really find it in their curriculum anywhere. And there are ways to talk about genocide, and you can't talk about the history of genocide unless you begin with the event that gave rise to the word genocide. Genocide is a term that was developed in 1947 to describe what happened during the war. And as I said earlier, I think If Arabs knew more about genocide, they'd have had a different reaction to Halabja. They'd have a different reaction to Darfur. The popular opinion would have reacted differently. So I think I make this case. Secondly, I think I haven't translated this into a specific curriculum, but the issue of that I'd like to point out is the double standard that one hears from many Arabs about differentiating between Jews and Zionists. This is a very common refrain that one hears in Arab societies. We have no problem with Jews, we protect Jews, they live amongst us, etc. It's just Zionists we hate and detest. And we make this clear distinction. Except if we look at it under close inspection, it doesn't hold water. It's actually a clear double standard. If indeed it was true, then there would be no reluctance to embrace the heroes. Then there'd be no reluctance to embrace Arabs who saved Jews. On the contrary, if indeed it was true, Arabs would celebrate the heroes and say, in spite of this, we make this distinction. Then the distinction would have greater validity. But they're reluctant to embrace the heroes, precisely because there's something deeper at work. I think there's something much deeper at work. And it goes to the point that you just referred to, which is the departure of so many hundreds of thousands of Jews from Arab lands. If it was only about Zionism, why did so many Jews leave? So many of those Jews were not Zionists, did not come to Israel. They went to Europe, they went to Canada, wherever they went. Something much deeper is at work. And in my view, what the something that is much deeper, and this is a gross oversimplification, but in my view, the something that is much deeper is the empowerment of Jews that was represented by Israel. Not Israel itself, or not just Israel itself, but the empowerment of Jews. That historically, Jews lived as a tolerated minority. Now, yes, it is absolutely true that you were much better off being born a Jew in Muslim lands over the last 1,500 years than if you were a Jew born in Christendom. Chances are likely that you would not be burned at the stake if you were born in Muslim lands, that your children would not be sent into slavery if you were born in Muslim lands. It just was not going to happen. The opposite is not true. Namely, life for Jews in Muslim lands was not a rose garden either. It was not a life of equality. It was a life of tolerance, toleration, being tolerated as a second-class citizen isn't the right word since most of them didn't have citizenship, but second-class status. And the idea of Israel, the idea that the Jews would overturn that millennium-old concept of being subordinate, that, I think, was behind, is the deeper explanation for why so many thousands who were not Zionists were compelled to leave. And so, yes, I think it is very important to engage on these issues, very important to explore, for people to understand what is really at work here. And I firmly believe that you can have these sorts of open, frank, and honest and candid discussions in this part of the world, and that if you avoid doing it, then you're just part of the problem. But if you have these conversations, then you're at least trying to reach solutions. Yes?
Yes. For the sake of intellectual completeness, only, for the sake of intellectual completeness, I was astonished that you didn't mention, among what you find in the Arab world, another case that worries us very much. You mentioned Holocaust deniers. You mentioned those who say, yes, there was an Holocaust, it was good that there was an Holocaust. However, we find in Europe, at least, something that I would like to know if you find in the Arab countries, which is to say, on the contrary, yes, of course there was an Holocaust, and it was terrible, etc. And this is why the state of Israel was created and brought upon us all the problems that the Europeans should have paid about, and we are paying for it. So it is the reverse.
Yeah.
You find this in Europe. I mean, you find this in the Arab countries?
Yes,
Or you don't find it?
no, you do find this. This is another common response, which is it's actually a subset of ignorance, which is, look, let's say the Holocaust did happen. Let's say, of course it happened. But this is Europeans expiating their guilt at the expense of Arabs. And this is actually one of the reasons why some Arabs are unwilling even to begin a discussion of this issue, because in their narrative, it leads down a slippery slope to validating Israel. That any discussion of the Holocaust will lead to a validation of Israel. So I'm not even going to discuss it, so I don't accept it. So this is, one finds this. Now, how do you respond? How does one respond? One can respond in a historical sense. One can respond by pointing out that the great powers, Britain, for example, proposed partition well before the first German tank went into Poland, well before there was a Holocaust, and that Israel, the Zionist movement, was poised for success even before. It was probably accelerated, surely accelerated by the Holocaust, but the die was cast beforehand. That's a historical detail that is just confusing. Or you can actually just deal with it head on, which is, let's talk about the Holocaust and don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I would say to Arabs, don't be afraid. You get off this roller coaster any point you want. Let's have an honest discussion, and when you want to get off, you stop. But why are you so bashful that you think that you can't control a conversation, that if you walk in the door, you don't have an exit? So I would say, force them in the door, start the conversation. And that's really one of the things that this book is all about. I know that many of you want to ask questions, but I'm told that that time is short. Let me again, for my sake, thank you so much. It's really been a privilege being able to speak with you this evening.